Good afternoon, and welcome to the Elevating Diverse Perspectives to Advance Organizational Outcomes panel presentation. I'm Tiffany Mara, the Director of CEW. For those of you who are unable to see the visual component of this presentation, I have black hair with gray streaks, glasses over my brown eyes, and I'm wearing a blue jacket with a brownish gold colored shirt. I'm sitting in an office with windows behind me. It's my honor to serve as the facilitator for today's panel, featuring an amazing cast of leaders in the DEI space. We have Wendy John, the head of Global Diversity and Inclusion at Fidelity Investments, Sonya Jacobs, Special Advisor to the President, Chief Organizational Learning Officer at U of M, and Senior Director of Faculty and Leadership Development at the University of Michigan Medical School. Dilip Das, PhD, is the Assistant Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at U of M. And Kristen Howard, JD, is the Senior Director in the Office for Health, Equity, and Inclusion at U of M's Medical School. Welcome to all of you panelists. Thank you so much for joining me today. It truly is amazing to be sitting in a panel alongside you as the facilitator. The panel today is made possible through our partnership with Fidelity, our Platinum corporate sponsor. I'm confident that the experiences and perspectives shared today will provide you with new strategies for recognizing and honoring unique perspectives. While each of us can listen to the panel, let's ask ourselves if that's enough. The impact of this panel will actually be determined by what we do with the information shared today. With that in mind, I would like each person who is joining us today to grab a pen and a piece of paper so you can complete the following challenge. As you listen to today's presentation, I challenge you to identify one strategy or insight that you will take back to your team. I'll send out a survey to all attendees in a few weeks to gather the strategies and insights that you identified in your progress on this challenge. Imagine, just imagine, for all of us on this panel presentation as attendees or panelists, imagine the collective impact that we can have if each of us just moves the needle a little in our own unique spaces. With that, I'm going to begin by asking each panelist to please take a couple of minutes to introduce yourself and what led you to your passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Yep, Dilip, if you could start us off, that would be great.
Thank you, Tiffany, and it's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation and welcome, and it's an honor to be with these panelists as well. My name is Dilip Das. I am a South Asian and American looking kind of guy with black hair, grayish sideburns, a gray jacket, and a white shirt, and well, I guess it's kind of a whitish background. And to your question, I think there are two main roots of interest that converged to develop my passion for diversity, equity, inclusion work. One was from education itself, a passion for books and learning and ideas and teaching. I started teaching early in life and right out of college. And the satisfaction of guiding myself and students toward the power of knowledge and discovery was really meaningful. Particularly the idea of realizing connections in the world and between people. And that's true power as students realize those connections and start making those ideas about connections together as well. And some of that was fed by my studying of ecology, which really highlights the power of web of life connections inherent in the natural world. The diversity of life as a measure of the ecosystem's health is really powerful as well. One of my early writer mentors was Aldo Leopold, and he said that once we learn the truth of Darwin's evolution, it should be clear to us to develop a natural sense of kinship between people and other creatures, a wish to live and let live. And that was a very powerful connection for me. Another early pioneer in ecology that had a deep impact on me was Rachel Carson, who coined the term a sense of wonder about the unbelievable diversity of life, including the life of humans and the vast number of languages, cultures, and people in the world. The second, I think thread to close out this question for me, the second thread that drew me to a passion for DEI was my growing up as a biracial individual, meaning not only in two cultures and understanding two worlds, because each of my parents came from really radically different rural backgrounds in two different countries, but actually three cultures, because my sisters and I were forging a third culture growing up in circumstances that were far different than either of my parents. My neighborhood too, and my friends and relatives were multiracial and multi-ethnic. And that early exposure to multicultural life is so important. And segregated neighborhoods and schools do not contribute to an understanding of these things. And I was fortunate not to have that. So I had that advantage. There's actually a term for that my childhood experience is called third culture kids. Having a natural intersectional family and life experience that brings, I think, a true source of strength, and trained me to be fluid and flexible, to understand ambiguity and uncertainty. So there's certainly a lot of that in DEI work, and I feel very comfortable in those environments. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, Wendy, would you mind going next?
Sure thing. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Fidelity is thrilled to be, co-hosting today's session. So I'm Wendy John. I'm the head of global diversity and inclusion at Fidelity Investments. And, if I were to think about, I'm joining you today, one from Durham, North Carolina. So that's one aspect of diversity in terms of geographic location. I know Tiffany provided some description for, sort of for those who might not be able to see us today. I am a, Black female of Caribbean origin, if that's helpful. And what I would say for me in terms of my passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion work, it's a great question, although I feel like my entire lived experience perhaps is a study in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I was originally born in Trinidad and Tobago, and then immigrated to Canada to study for university. And once I graduated, then immigrated permanently to the United States. And so I think when you grow up on an island that, depending on the map you're looking at, appears to be a small dot, you spend a lot of your life, that early part of your life, looking outwardly, right? While celebrating your own, culture and country history, you're getting a very vast global view, right? So I had to study global history and got exposure. If you are not familiar, Trinidad is very diverse in terms of not only our history, in terms of who all claimed us at one point, right? The Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the British. So we have all of those influences. And being like the southernmost island in the Caribbean, we are only at our closest point about 100 miles off of the coast of Venezuela. And so there's a lot of immigration from Venezuela to Trinidad, and a lot of Spanish influences, although English is the native tongue. So, I grew up with a lot of diversity, not only around me in terms of the people, but also in terms of our culture, the food, and the religions that were practiced. I was equally as likely to pass a temple or a mandir as I was to pass a church. And so that exposure really early on just creates a different perspective on what is possible. And also, we celebrate many holidays in Trinidad, quite some would say too many, but we actually, what that taught me was the ability to be able to really appreciate somebody else's culture and also participate in the celebration, right? They don't have to be separate. So, I think, Dilip, you mentioned sort of, third culture. I think that is also sort of a perspective that many of us who immigrate, one hidden thing that everyone doesn't know is, there's sort of a nomad aspect to people who immigrate, right? You no longer belong in the culture that you originated in because you have now moved somewhere else and you're different, and you never quite belong where you are either. And so there's just something to be said for that, and why that would drive an affinity to this work in particular. Belonging becomes a critical aspect of my lived experience. And having navigated many spaces that I would say weren't really created for someone like me, I have always wanted to extend that, to others, and make sure that their experience is smoother, perhaps, than what I myself had experienced over my lifetime. So thanks for the opportunity for sharing a bit of my passion for this work.
And good afternoon. I'm Kristen Howard. I'll jump in here. So I think my passion for this work really developed over time. I grew up locally here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And to give a little background about myself, I'm an African-American woman. I use she, her pronouns. I have shoulder-length hair, and I'm wearing a black and blue button-up top in an office setting. But I grew up here in Ann Arbor, and I decided to go to Howard University in Washington, D.C. And so for those who are part of the Ann Arbor community, it has diversity, but it's still Midwestern, and it is still, there's a predominant culture for sure in this area. And so when I got to Howard, I really had, first of all, an expanded view of even what Blackness means, right? That is not a monolith. There are plenty of folks from Trinidad at Howard University who are coming directly from their island and have their own culture. There are New Yorkers. My first roommate was from Harlem. I'm from Ann Arbor. We are not the exact same. We have different cultural perspectives. So learning about that rich diversity and the celebration of it, Howard University is really a celebration of culture and of history and of art, our unique experiences as they come together, and then exiting that environment and heading back to a more traditional setting, and recognizing that all of that celebration wasn't given the same excitement, that diversity wasn't as important, in a corporate setting as it had been in my university community, and as it was in my friend community and people who I socialize with. And so I think figuring out how to be successful, what success looks like, and how to stay true to self and be consistent with my values and who I wanted to be really led me into this work. And I started it very much on the ground level. So, that first kind of pushback against the corporate environment that is not looking for diversity, I said, okay, I'm going to education. I'm going back to the people. I'm gonna directly impact folks who have a need and who I do believe in and want to see celebrated and uplifted and empowered. And so I worked in K-12 education, which is really an opportunity to be on that ground level and do the work of empowering communities. I was in Detroit, which is obviously an urban environment. And so thinking about how, in our corporate spaces, diversity and equity and inclusion is an ideal and it's a hope, but many times our corporate entities could survive if we didn't diversify. And that's a very important factor in how this work evolves and how it's done. But in a place like Detroit, we're fighting for our very existence as a school district for our young people. If diversity is not celebrated, there's no path in some ways, right? We have to open the door. Like there's no other entry point. And so from learning that and then coming back into a space that still offers that learning community here at the university, but also has an opportunity to say, how can we increase diversity to strengthen us, to strengthen our practices? That really is what excites me about this work.
And then I think I'll close out then the introductions. I'm Sonya Jacobs. I'm a Black female with progressively graying hair. I am wearing tortoiseshell glasses and a black and white jacket in my home office, surrounded by things that I love: Asian art, flowers, and you can't see the saxophone, the picture of a saxophone up here on the wall. I love music as well. And Tiffany, thank you so very much. And to all of you for allowing me to join you on this esteemed panel and talk about something that is really important to me. I too have the lived experience that has brought me to this work and has created the passion to, as Wendy put, help people navigate the spaces that I've had to navigate without a lot of the wisdom and the knowledge that is surrounding us here today. I grew up in the city of Detroit. I say born at the corner of Grit and Grace, and then moved here to Ann Arbor. But, I went to a school just west of here, I'll say, and I do bleed green for all of you who don't know me. But it was quite a different experience for me coming from Detroit, then going to MSU, where 3% of my class were comprised of people of color. And so I learned very quickly what it meant to be different and to be in a marginalized community. But that also gave me a lot of, let's say, incentive and fuel to really want to learn, to want to create a space that would be different for not just myself, but for other people. I experienced, subtle discriminatory hiring practices, being told that I was overqualified for a job in retail, go figure. But, it was then entering into human resources and organizational development that I saw a pathway to learn and make change for others, to do what I could to make changes in hiring practices and how we develop and support people to bring their best selves. And I think it was in early 2000s. It's amazing to think it's been that long since I came to the university, where I had a chance to, help with the training of leaders in diversity. And it's funny, Kristen, because prior to coming to Michigan, I was training at the Detroit Public Schools on coaching and helping principals to advance, the mission the school system. So I've had a lot of experience, lived experiences that have been challenging, but also really rewarding, that I bring to this space of trying to make it a better place for everyone to thrive and bring their best selves. Thank you.
Yeah, thank each of you for sharing and trusting us with your background. Just in the short amount of time that we've learned a bit about you, I heard several different intersections come out. So I'm going to read them to you because I'm taking notes on my pen and paper. Race came out, being multiracial, language, geographic location, food, religion. Food came out again, history, immigration, citizenship, family values, urban versus suburban versus rural, social economic status. All of these play a role in how we define our unique perspectives. How do you understand your intersectional identities as a source of strength in your work? And you've already touched on this a bit. And how do you define your unique perspective? Kristen, if we could start with you, that'd be great.
Yeah, I can start off on that one. And so, looking at all of the categories that you just mentioned, they all play a role. And I think it's important to really recognize the spaces in which there is power and privilege, even as a woman of color. I'm still, I consider myself both a Bison and a Hoya. I went to Georgetown for law school, and that carries with it some sense of power. And people, you have title, at this stage in all of our careers, there's a sense of who we are as associated with our job and our job positions. There's also, me as a woman, there are things that I've learned and things that you see and interacting and lessons that are taught to you about how you interact with the men in your environment, and those who are invited to the golf outings and the beer nights and those who are not, right? So there's a lot of every piece. It's hard to say what about me defines my unique perspective, because I think everything about me is a part of my unique perspective. Coming from Ann Arbor and then having an urban experience and living in Washington, D.C. for 14 years and seeing those different places and how people interact in those different spaces and coming back, all of those make up who you are. And even religion. I come from a very religiously conservative background. And so there are a lot of things, a lot of expectations and the way that people still feel to this day about certain groups. You know, those feelings haven't changed in conservative religious circles. So how do I go back and interact with those groups? And what empathy can I have for those who are coming from groups and have been only exposed to one side of things? So I think part of the unique perspective and the unique opportunity that we have as professionals and folks who have moved in and out of spaces is that you can see the diversity and you can appreciate it. But you'll run into a lot of folks in your practice who have not been in a diverse situation. If you're still in, you know, and there's nothing wrong with being true and staying in your hometown, that's a wonderful life experience as well, but that's all you know. And if you've only been in one community or been exposed to one way of thinking, I think that can sometimes, it just limits the opportunity that you have to react and interact in different ways, and your opportunities to have experienced and questioned your thinking on things. So I think having a lot of different identities and life experience builds a unique perspective, which strengthens your ability to talk to others about their unique selves, to accept them for who they are, to help move them forward along the path if there are places they need to go and things they need to recognize. So I try to bring as much of myself as I can safely to the work, because all of it matters and all of it allows you to better identify with all of the different unique people that you're going to meet along the way.
Yeah, I think, Kristen, you make some excellent points. You know, for me, when I think about, you know, my unique perspective, and Tiffany, you did actually identify a number of aspects of or dimensions of diversity. But I would actually say, right, a lot of how we define diversity today is very much based on sort of like visible differences for the most part. And I would argue that you know, I'm someone who is always very good at math. I was a math major, right? When I went to Canada, it was to study actuarial science. I am a highly visual learner. I've been told in the past that I might have a photographic memory. I think some aspects of that tell you much more about me, and really are more of the unique perspective that I bring, that I would tap into as a source of strength, right? Some of that background informs a lot of how I think and how I approach problems. And I like complex problems. I like ambiguity. Yes, I'm sure that some of that ability to sort of thrive in ambiguous situations was perhaps informed by, you know, me living in 3 different countries, and having to sort of, you know, navigate that. But at the same time, I do think, maybe controversial statement to make here, but, you know, we have a construct here that was pretty much informed by the need for a census, particularly in North America, that actually leads us to lean into stereotypes, right? Where we try to define people as one category or another. And it's really, really limiting. So it's super important that I think, you know, that you actually try to engage with each person individually and understand sort of what is different about their particular experience, you know, whether it be that they lived and grew up in a small town, you know, whether it be, you know, just sort of socioeconomic factors or other things. There's often more that we have in common than is different from each other. And you can only find that out by really intentionally engaging with people with a desire to understand them. But I would say, as it relates to, you know, a source of strength in my work, it certainly isn't. I would never throw away the fact that I got early exposure to diversity. And, you know, really, I mean, I had to study, you know, I had religion classes. So I had to read the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita. Like, you see more the things that, like, just by doing that exercise at a young age, you recognize commonality, right? It's not that the practices are different, and there are certainly some fundamental differences, but you're also able to see where there might be connection points. And I think that anchored me a lot in always looking for the commonality versus highlighting the difference.
If I can piggyback on that, with the similarities and the difference, and I think about how I leverage my intersectionalities as a woman and a woman of color, right? And the biases that I think all women of all races and ethnicities experience, I can empathize with that. And I go back to a book that I read by Ella Bell Edmondson called Our Separate Ways. And it really talked about our unique diversities. And I appreciate, Wendy, you bringing it up. There's so many dimensions of diversity, our religious beliefs, our political beliefs, our values, but we do tend to focus on the primary, right? That which we can see. And we need to look beyond that, because we all bring so much to the table that we can leverage. And it does require for us to be open to hear the different voices and perspectives, to learn the stories that we don't know, so that we can work together and really leverage those commonalities and address some of the challenges that we face. And when we talk about drawing on the strengths in our work, I do think that leveraging my intersectionality, sharing my own personal story and what I have been through, opens the door up for conversation and helps to create a safe space, because I've walked in those shoes. And so I have an understanding of what has occurred in my life and my lived experience, but I also too have privilege in terms of where I work and what I do. And we have to make sure that we're also acknowledging that and leveraging that as well.
Hi, I'll just quickly add, first of all, when Wendy was talking about immigrating from the southernmost Caribbean island, I couldn't help but think of the Hamilton song, Immigrants We Get the Job Done, which you're doing, Wendy, as a Black woman changing the world here. That song was obviously sung by a Latinx man, but portraying a white man immigrant from the islands. But great song, by the way. I just wanted to quickly add too that, that we have to really actively reject the I guess the word is, the dual or the two only forces of identity that are foisted upon us by media, whether it's social media, whether it's television, and really absorb and accept the notion that we have so many identities. For instance, my wife was recently saying, I'm a gamer. That's one of my identities. That's not listed on a typical thing as an identity. And yet that cuts through so many of the primary typical binary types of identities that the media and social media foist upon us. We're so rich, we are multitudes, right, in terms of our identities. And those things have to be pointed out because they do connect us. I will quickly add that one thing that some of us are doing on campus is trying to think about that from an interfaith perspective, because faith also cuts through the false binary identity trap that are foisted upon us. And whether that faith is a traditional religion or no religion at all, it still connects us, and it really cuts us and really points to our deeper connections and things that we hold similar to, rather than the divisions that we have.
And Kristen, in her response to this question, mentioned something interesting, which feels a little bit like sugarcoating, but I'm going to go ahead and restate it, which is lessons learned. And so tying into that, did you have any aha moments early in your career that led you to understand your ability to affect change? And when did you start to recognize or live into it? Yeah. Sonya, if we could start with you, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think back to at the health system, again, in the early 2000s, facilitating diversity training. And it was the power of storytelling that I think enabled me to really affect change. Again, telling my story and allowing myself to be vulnerable, acknowledging that I too have biases. So when we talk about the various dimensions of diversity, right, we have biases, we all do. And we just have to understand that we have them and how we manage and mitigate them. And I think it was the power of telling my story and allowing myself to be vulnerable and humble allowed me to learn and help others to learn and grow and develop skills to be much more versed in the dimensions of diversity, but the impact, you know, and the benefits of diversity as well. And then I also think about most recently, again, as the country wrestled with racial and social injustice after the death of George Floyd, and using my voice and my position to help to create change and bring people along. Again, sharing my story. And I too have experienced many of the same situations that others have. And leveraging that voice to engage leaders, make change. But acknowledging the fact that I'm there with you, we are all still growing and learning, but it is about leveraging my space and who I am to really help affect change for everyone. And that was a pivotal moment for me, 2002, as well as 2020.
And since Tiffany gave me a little challenge, I will jump in there with a little more salt than sugar. But and my first working experience, I mentioned it briefly in my introduction, I was a corporate lawyer, and it was over a decade ago, and the kind of practice that I was in, there was not a lot of space for diversity. I mean, there is a bottom line, and that is what we care about. And that is what our clients need us to care about. They need us to win. They need us to make them money. And that is what matters. And everything else is secondary to making this money. Like, that's it, right? And so, I mean, I had one time, my boss directly told me, he said, we didn't hire you because you were Black. We're not into that. We don't do that diversity stuff. You're just a good lawyer. And that's why we selected you. And I was like, okay. And he was right. They were not into that diversity stuff. And so I learned a lot in that experience. And like I said, it was a little bit in terms of an aha moment. And I think this is important to share. At that point, I did not know how to fix it. I was like, this is a little crazy. I don't think they really care about me. I'm just afraid. I got to get out of here. And I think that's, we are lucky enough to do this work. But for most people, when you hit those walls of like, I don't know how to elevate my diverse perspective, you kind of feel like maybe I just need to opt out. And in the corporate law profession, they lose about 80% of associates within 5 years for a variety of reasons. So it is not uncommon for folks to opt out of that lifestyle. And so the aha moment really came after opting out. So like I said, I'm going to opt out. I'm going to go fight for the people. I'm getting into the trenches. I'm done with this. And so I end up in K-12 education. And, it was there that I started in compliance, actually, in Detroit. And I was working on cases that were really, with the United States Department of Education, things that were out of compliance, that had gone wrong, so wrong that they had reached a federal level, and there had to be a resolution imposed on the school district. And so it was very still, I'm still a little bit of my corporate self. And I'm like, I'm going to clear this case. I'm going to win this case for the district, protect the district, get it done. But I started to realize in that work that the solutions that we were fitting, because this was the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights that I was working with, the solutions that we were devising to remedy these issues and concerns that had arisen were affecting the most vulnerable. So there are a lot of pieces to our unique perspectives. There's a lot that makes us who we are, but there are still privilege and power. And there are certain parts of our identities that are not privileged. And there are certain parts of us that people have decided, and that the structures around us and the systems around us have placed in a less empowered position. And so when I was working for those children, doing what I thought was just kind of boring compliance, I started to realize that, if I can change the way the school district deals with students with disabilities, if I can ensure that there is a clear path for reporting sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, this actually changes the way that people interact with the system. This is the way to affect the most vulnerable among the most vulnerable, right? And in that, I'm like, this is important. This really matters. There are folks who are so marginalized, who have maybe such a small group, such a unique identity, that there's not a voice for them. And so having the opportunity to become that voice in a leadership role and an operational role to change the structures that affected those who couldn't do it for themselves, that was exciting. And that was my aha moment of why this work is so important.
Yeah, I would just want to chime in here a little bit to say, an interesting aha moment for me, and as you heard me say, I started off my career on the actuarial side. So I entered into the corporate world, Kristen, with no misconception, right? I knew that I was going into a field and a profession that where, Black women in particular were pretty much underrepresented. There aren't a ton of actuaries in the world anyway, right? And so, there was that to start. I think a big aha for me, being someone who came from an achievement, mindset and household, was, very quickly when I arrived, and again, I had an actuarial science degree major from one of the top schools for that profession. I had passed many of my early exams already, which most of my peers in the cohort that they hired out of college had not. And I remember going on a first trip for training to Cleveland, and on the travel there, having one of my colleagues say, you're an affirmative action hire. And I actually was, by virtue just on the merits of like what you need to qualify for the job, was like the most qualified. And so, so that, to be honest, it was interesting. It wasn't jarring personally, but it was just sort of interesting to me that was how I was being perceived. And so so that's the starting point of it. But what I will tell you is that in many instances throughout my career, quite frankly, too many, I was the first and often the only. But what I started to notice was that after I was in spaces, or while I was in spaces, leaders started hiring more people that looked like me. And while we're not the same, and quite frankly, there were instances where they hired people that I said, I don't know that they're the right person for the job. It made me realize that my mere presence was actually having an impact. And so I think the aha moment, I would say, is it's oftentimes we can spend a lot of the time and our energy sort of, kind of comforting ourselves at the fact that we're like the only and like wondering like, just wanting there to be more. And not realizing that we actually have some power in that space, right? Our showing up and doing a great job and really demonstrating our ability to be successful within some of these spaces makes it somewhat difficult for others to argue against the next person that shows up. And I would also say in all of those spaces, I also tried to get involved in recruiting, which then helped bring a different perspective, right, in terms of how you look at talent. And so I share that for maybe someone in the audience that's thinking sometimes that, oh, these systems are too big and how can I possibly influence? And I often share our mere presence is influencing and changing systems. So the first step is actually being there, right? And then the rest of it is about doing a really good job and demonstrating the value that we bring.
I'll just quickly chime in saying I have aha/OMG moments almost every other day.
With you.
Philip, do you want to expand on that a bit? No, okay. All right. Now, I know a question that often arises. I remember even when in my dissertation defense, I got asked this question a little differently formed, but can you share a real world example of how elevating diverse perspectives has helped your organization advance the work?
So I'd love to kick that off. I think, you know, many have probably heard others talk about the value of affinity groups, right? So employee resource groups and others. I'm a huge, you know, champion for affinity groups because, like I mentioned about being sort of the only, my early days of action, I would say, around diversity and inclusion was around just as I saw others in our workplace that looked like me, starting to capture, like being like, hey, who are you? I don't know you. We have not met before. And starting to gather us as a group together. That's, in my opinion, sort of the informal starting grassroots phase of many of these affinity groups. And while most start off with, you know, on a search for community, right, and visibility, they actually can amplify and really have an impact on the business. And so for us at Fidelity, our groups are much more than a voluntary support organization for our employees. They actually help us see dimensions of experience that we might otherwise overlook, whether that's in you know, the experiences that our own associates are having, or what our customers might be having, or even the communities in which we all live. And so I could give you a few examples of places where those affinity groups have actually helped us be better about the way that we engage with our customers, whether it's from products or services that we offer. So, you know, through our LGBTQ plus employee resource group, our Pride group, you know, we were able to partner with our investor centers to offer financial planning seminars that were tailored specifically to that community, where your partner might be someone of the same sex or maybe in a slightly different circumstance, and also just tailoring the conversation, right, to the needs of the LGBTQ plus community. We created the attainable savings account for disability related expenses, right? We have investment vehicles that are focused on companies that have women in leadership roles to continue to, you know, put our allyship into action. And, you know, these customer products and experiences, they came to life more quickly and with more conviction. And I'd argue greater success because our affinity groups' voices were heard. Prioritizing inclusion activates and engages our employees, our customers, and the community. So that's a real world example of where engaging diverse perspectives actually can make the products, the services that you offer, you know, better.
I'll jump in with, I'd like to bring in 3 quick perspectives of elevating voices, which are from university, from a massive bureaucratic university perspective, can be marginalized. So when we talk about power and privilege, you know, we think about looking to the voices who have the least power in elevating issues where institutions have to grow and provide accessible opportunity for growth and for thriving. One would be starting in about 2008. I started meeting with some students who were undocumented and who were struggling to maintain opportunities to thrive at Michigan for the primary reason that they were, even though had grown up in the state of Michigan and were, for all intents and purposes, residents of the state of Michigan, were assessed international and out-of-state fees. One student in particular was only able to afford the first 3 years of college because here at Michigan, because she was on her way back, walking back from a job as a gas station attendant. She was hit by a car. She ultimately got a settlement, an insurance settlement that paid for her out-of-state tuition, but she ran out of that by the time she was a senior year. She was triple majoring and a 4.0 student, but was in doubt of whether she was going to be able to graduate. We were able to find financial aid for her, but what that really catalyzed was a student-led effort to focus on undocumented and then soon later documented students in order to thrive and survive here. Students acted up, We heard them, we listened to them, we heard their voices. And when you hear voices of students talking about their real issues and some of the barriers to progress and completion here, that's when action happens. Another great example, and it worked. It did work, and it did provide opportunities for in-state residency to happen and need-based financial aid as well. Another example, which led to, I believe, one of the primary reasons for the University of Michigan starting the 5-year strategic DEI project in 2016 was the 2013 BBUM, or Being Black at Michigan, student uprising, really exposing the level of vulnerability of micro and macro aggressions that Black students had experienced while on campus. And those were painful and poignant examples that got national attention. And it also resulted in real advances from a perspective of infrastructure at the University of Michigan for Black students and other students of color on campus. And then the third one is something that happened, again, I think belatedly, when disabled students and faculty and staff really got together and started thinking about notions of disability justice and hearing from disabled student voices about not only physical barriers, but structural barriers in their way to access for thriving at the University of Michigan. That resulted in a task force that released about 72 recommendations in which we are whittling away at. And it really also convened a sense of community and a sense of moving toward justice for disabled people on campus as well. So I would just elevate those three examples of marginalized voices being heard. First of all, having the courage to stand up and speak up, and then work together. Single voices can be heard, but multiple voices with single or united messages are much more powerful. And that's what happened in all three of these examples.
Dilla, very similar to what you've described in terms of the grassroots efforts to bring voice to some of the challenges that our marginalized communities face. At Michigan Medicine, we had, following the death of George Floyd, the White Coats for Black Lives, basically, really challenged the organization to make substantial change with how we deal with racism. And we formed the AROC, is what we call it, Anti-Racism Oversight Committee. But it was through those voices that the institution developed this formal structure to help us address many of the issues that you've described. How do we use the collective voices to speak up and stand up for those who speak up? What do we need to do to diversify the workforce? Convening individuals to help us think about what advocacy looks like and or professional development so that we can make change. And those are some ways in which we use very diverse perspectives, a broad representation of the organization, the learners, the faculty, the staff, to come together to tackle these issues. And I think it was doing that we have come up with some really robust, actionable plans that will make a difference, not just for those working and walking the halls of Michigan Medicine, but for our community as well. It is required that we really look and address the health disparities and how we recruit all of our processes. And it was bringing together those different voices that I think have had an impact. And then on the informal side, it is similar to Wendy and the description around the affinity groups, bringing these diverse perspectives together to really talk about it or challenge each other, right? To address the issues with, let's say, the advancement of women, or Are we bringing in other diverse perspectives to have conversations around allyship? I think of one person in particular. We talk about the diversity tax. It's always or oftentimes those that look like us that are out there on the front lines trying to educate and move things forward, where we have a non-BIPOC individual who was willing to step up and say, I want to be an ally. And that to me is elevating a diverse perspective, a voice that you don't necessarily see in this conversation, but willing to learn and willing to give voice and show the privilege, if you will, that that one particular person had, and then think about how they share that privilege. So I think we need to really think broadly when we talk about diversifying, you know, or bringing in diverse perspectives. It requires a collective and everybody's unique dimensions of diversity to come out and support and be allies. And I think that has been really helpful for us, you know, not the usual suspects to help elevate, bring voice, and champion the work.
And I am very new to the organization, but as I start to kind of review initiatives and see what has happened, you know, in recent years at Michigan Medicine in the Office for Health Equity and Inclusion, part of our work is pipeline programs. And so as we know, the market for talent is increasingly tight. Right now, hiring is a challenge for all organizations. And so you have to find talent. You have to get smarter about how we source talent and how we attract talent. And I think I've seen through our pipeline programs, looking at our data, how we have, you know, changed the face of admissions in our medical school and how that is continuing to grow in the diversity in our medical school and within our residency programs. And that leads to, you know, our greatest recruitment for our faculty members comes from our residency programs. So it's not always an end game, right? There is a growing path along which at each point when we bring, you know, through programs that reach out to high schools and undergraduate institutions and bring students on campus and get them excited and interested who are from different backgrounds in our university and in their opportunities here, that leads to a greater applicant pool, allows us to admit more students, allows us to grow that pipeline on into the faculty. And we know that even affects outcomes because patient concordance with their providers leads to better outcomes. So when we have more diverse providers, we have better patient outcomes. So when you look at it all along the spectrum at each level, it doesn't just advance the work of DEI, it actually advances the work of the institution as a whole and its ability to be a better, more efficient service provider.
Now, each of you in your own unique ways talked about how giving voice, giving space, giving structure to diverse perspectives is key to really acknowledging changes that need to happen within organizations. Now, there are always situations when you might have experienced someone who has been insensitive to diverse perspectives. Can you share how you've navigated those situations, you know, where someone may be trying to shut down participation by members of a team?
If I may take a stab at that one, because I've seen it countless times when someone inadvertently and often unintentionally shut down a voice that really needed to be heard. And first, I always want to think about positive intent. Okay, so they didn't necessarily intend to do that, but by doing so, I think we lose that diverse perspective, or we lose that creativity and or innovation. And so one of the things I've always tried to do is name the behavior and not shame the offender, okay? And just kind of speak to the fact that by shutting that person down, we lost an opportunity to hear that voice. And then to also, you know, just provide some skills or lessons learned, you know, how I may have stepped into that too, and what I did to try to recover from that. Because oftentimes people don't mean to shut individuals down. Now, there are some cases when they don't want to hear the perspective of that voice, and that's a whole different story. But oftentimes it's unintentional. And so we have to all kind of create an environment where people can speak up. And when we see someone being shut down, we leverage our position to help elevate that voice or call that person out. Say, hey, you know, I'm pretty sure you have some thoughts to share, Dilip, on this conversation. But always, you know, starting with positive intent, naming that behavior, but then also elevating the voices to the extent that we can do that ourselves.
And I think I'll reach back into the past a little bit, and I've been in situations where with training, where people just have not, as we continue to evolve our understanding of diversity and to learn new language, sometimes people just have not quite caught up with where we are. And so I was at a training once where someone just simply told me, I just don't even know what all this stuff is. And when I first became professional, I didn't have to do this. So I can't handle this. And the response really is, okay, I get it. I get that you didn't learn it. I get that this is new to you, that this is something that feels different. But the question I always return to them is like, but what does it actually take away from you or hurt you to learn this new thing? Like if we just kind of push through whatever you're feeling in this moment, and then we just learn this new language, or we learn how to interact with a new group of people, how might that affect you in a negative way? And generally, folks don't have an answer. Now, I will say in one instance, dealing with language around gender, actually, and young people with a teenager, I did have someone tell me, well, the teenagers are mean. And the teenagers who are struggling with their gender are meaner. Those are the meanest kids, and they're the snappiest, and they're just mean. I get hurt. My feelings get hurt dealing with them. And I, in that situation, which is very specific, I'm like, with the power balance, teenagers are always snappy. All teenagers are snappy. But, how about we try to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, right? Who is struggling not only with being a teenager and having the regular hormones of being a teenager, but who is also struggling with identity and understanding who they are and how they relate to the world, and who is obviously facing challenges and ridicule in certain circles, which leads to defensiveness. So, a lot of times I think insensitivity just comes from being a little bubbled and not quite looking outside of ourselves and seeing what that other perspective is about and why it's important. And so kind of when we can get out of centering our own feelings, and that's what I try to work on people with in training, let's try to not just center our own feelings in this space.
Yeah, I think the what I would just add there, is that, the ability to be insensitive in the moment is sort of somewhat an equal opportunity sport, and not trivializing the fact that, I would tell you for far too often and far too long, most of us actually just experience the insensitivity and don't have, the ability to use our voice. So that I think it's important that we first state that, right? I think, we've found ourselves in the last, 18 months or so in an environment where we're having conversations that we weren't able to have before. And quite frankly, people were not willing to have conversations about some of these topics, or even be reflective on the impact that their behavior may have had on others. And so, I know in a lot of other places we talk about this idea of giving people grace. I think, we have to understand first, right? And everyone is always making some determination as to whether this was intentional, right? Whether someone is just, negligent, or willfully negligent, there's a difference, right? But I think when we view some of these instances as an opportunity, perhaps to educate, that is helpful. And then we also have to be sensitized to the burden of the education being on the person that experienced the actual trauma. And so, I think all of us have to kind of commit to being reflective on how we're showing up and the impact that we're having. We need to be intentional, right? And make sure that we match those intentions with actions that will drive the outcome that we want. And then when somehow there's a mismatch and we have an outcome that is not what we wanted, we have to address it in the moment, right? And again, address it from a place of, wow, I see, or I can feel like maybe what I said didn't land the way I thought it should have, right? How did you get it? How did you take it, right? Don't make an assumption. Hear from the person how they perceived it, how they felt it, and then try to go for a remedy that would leave you both feeling good about the interaction, right? I think far too often we go into engagements wanting to go for a win or wanting to make sure that our point gets across. And oftentimes the real goodness is in where there's an opportunity to understand this another perspective or how another person was viewing that interaction. That sometimes is more achievable than actually going for some individual win.
Yeah, we are officially out of time at this point, and I want to be respectful of everyone's schedules. I do see some people already jumping off, but no doubt because of other meetings. But I'd like to once again thank you, Wendy, Sonya, Dilip, and Kristen for joining us today. And a special thank you to Fidelity for sponsoring this event and the many workshops in CEW's Financial Wellness Series. A special thank you goes to Sarah Hall, Sierra Merriman, Myra Wooten, and Patrick Vaughn, who are supporting on the back end, as well as CEW staff who played a role in today's event, especially Alicia Marting, Erin Lane, and Sarah Prince. The next event in our Financial Wellness Series will be on November 9th from 12 to 1 for individuals who have been recently hired by U-M, and we'll make sure to send out that information through our usual channels. Please don't forget about the challenge today. I appreciate all the thank yous coming through in the chat to our panelists. Be on the lookout for this afternoon for an evaluation survey for today's event, and I'll be in touch on October 26th to check in on your progress towards today's challenge. Thank you for joining us today, and together let's include, celebrate, and honor our own and others' unique perspectives. Thank you again to all the panelists.
Thank you.